გესალმებით ყველას, ძალიან დიდი მადლობა ბრძანებისთვის ეროვნულ სახლში. ჩვენ დღეს გვაქვს დისკუსია, რომელიც არის დისკუსიათა სერიის ნაწილი. ჩვენ დავიწყეთ წინა თვეში, დავისაუბრეთ ევროკავშირის და რუსეთსა და საქართველოს შორის ურთიერთობების შესახებ ასოცირების შეთანხმების ხელმოწერის მოლოდინში. დღეს ჩვენ კვლავ მოლოდინში ვართ, იმიტომ რომ ისის ბოლოს მოგესალმებით ვაწერთ ხელს ამ შეთანხმებას და დღეს ვისაუბრებთ კონკრეტულად ეკონომიკურ საკითხებზე. ეს იქნება საქართველოს, რუსეთსა და ევროკავშირის შორის ურთიერთობები დანახული ეკონომიკური კუთხით. მე ბევრს არ წაგართვებ, ბატონი კახა გოგოლაშვილი არის დღეს ჩვენი მოდერატორი, რომელიც დათვლებით წარმოგვიდგენს ჩვენ დღევანდელ სტუმრებს, მე უბრალოდ მოგახსენებთ ფორმატს. ჩვენი სტუმრები დღეს წარმოადგენენ ბატონი Emerson არის ბრიუსელიდან, ევროპული პოლიტიკის კვლევების ცენტრიდან, კაპიტანი Tamara Kovziridze თავისუფალი უნივერსიტეტიდან და ბატონი Sergey Aleksashenko, რომელიც არის მოსკოვიდან, ბატონი კახა მოგუყვება დაწვრილებით ყველა მათგანის ბიოგრაფიებზე. დაწვრილებით არა, მაინც იმიტომ რომ პრომეტი დრო დავშეს დისკუსიისთვის უშუალოდ. დასაწყისში ჩვენი სტუმრები გაგიწყებთ პრეზენტაციებს, შემდეგ ეხებათ დრო დისკუსიისთვის ერთმანეთში, ხოლო შემდგომ ჩვენ გავხსნით დისკუსიას, სადაც თქვენ შეგიძლიათ კითხვების დასმა. მე მხოლოდ იმას დავამატებ, რომ პროექტი ხორციელდება გერმანიის მარშალის ფონდის დაფინანსებით და მხარდაჭერით, ისაც დიდ მადლობას მოგახსენებ და მიკროფონს გადავცემ ბატონ კახას, რომელიც განწყობა დისკუსიას.
მადლობა გამოსავალიათ დღესთვის და მოწვევისთვის. მე ძალიან საინტერესო შეხვედრა არის. საქართველოს, ევროპა, რუსეთი და რაღაც ისეთ სიბარტყეებად. საქართველოს ქართული ექსპერტი, რუსი ექსპერტი და ევროპელი ექსპერტი. მე მგონია რომ ყველასთვის კარგად ცნობილია დისკუსიის მთლიანად რაღაც კონტექსტი, თემა. დიდი ხანია საუბრობთ უთანხმოებას შორის ევროპასა და რუსეთს შორის სწორედ აი ამ რეგიონთან ეკონომიკური ურთიერთობების მოდელებთან დაკავშირებით, კერძოდ თავისუფალი ვაჭრობის რეჟიმი, გრანტավորების თავისუფალი ვაჭრობის რეჟიმი ერთხელ და პროგრესული შემოთავაზება რუსეთიდან ევრაზიული ეკონომიკური გაერთიანების ან თანამშრომლობის და აქ არის საქართველოს პოზიცია, რა თქმა უნდა, საინტერესო ჩვენ ხედავთ რა პოზიცია არის შესაძლებლობა, მაგრამ არის თუ არა შესაძლებლობა რომ რაღაცნაირად დაწყდეს ეს ყველაფერი და მოიძებნოს რაღაც გზები იმისათვის რომ არავინ არ დარჩეს ესე გაბრაზებული და გულდაწყვეტილი ამ საკითხებთან დაკავშირებით. მე მინდა წარმოგიდგენოთ ახლა სამი მშვენიერი ექსპერტი, სწორად გამოჩენილი ექსპერტი, რომელიც აქ აი ბატონი Emersoni ის გახლავთ დიდი ხნის განმავლობაში ეხლა მუშაობს ბრიუსელში CEPS, Center for Economic Policy Studies, ცნობილი ძაკასიფტანტი, რომელიც დიდი ხანია მუშაობს სწორედ ევროპული პოლიტიკის, ევროკავშირის პოლიტიკის საკითხებზე, განსაკუთრებით ჩვენ რეგიონის მიმართ და ხშირად წინ უსწრებს ხოლმე ევროკომისიის რაღაც შემუშავებულ კომუნიკაციას და მოდელებს თანამშრომლობის თავისი სტრატეგიით. ის დიდი ხნის განმავლობაში მუშაობდა ასევე მოსკოვში ერთჩად, ასევე ლონდონის ეკონომიკურ სკოლაში უფროსი მკვლევარი გახდათ და ასე შემდეგ არის მრავალი პუბლიკაციის და ნაშრომის ავტორი და ძალიან ცნობილი პოლიტოლოგი და ექსპერტი განსაკუთრებით ეკონომიკური პოლიტიკის საკითხებში. ბატონი Sergey Aleksashenko ასევე გახლავთ ძალიან გამოჩენილი რუსი ექსპერტი, რომელიც მუშაობდა ახლა მგონია რომ მუშაობს კარნეგის ცენტრში. ის გახლავთ ეროვნული კვლევითი უნივერსიტეტის ეკონომიკის უმაღლესი სკოლის Macroeconomic კვლევების დირექტორი. ის მუშაობდა ასევე რუსეთის მთავრობაში, ხელისუფლებაში, მათ შორის იყო ფინანსთა მინისტრის მოადგილე, რამდენადაც მახსოვს, ასევე ეროვნული ბანკის ვიცე-პრეზიდენტი და ასე შემდეგ. დამთავრებული აქვს და იქ დაცული აქვს მოსკოვის ცენტრალური ეკონომიკისა და მათემატიკის ინსტიტუტში, რომელიც იყო ცნობილი, ესე ვთქვათ, სამეცნიერო ცენტრი თავის დროზე ჯერ კიდევ საბჭოთა კავშირში. და ქალბატონი თამარ კოვზირიძე, რომელიც გახლავთ თავისუფალი უნივერსიტეტის პროფესორი, წლების განმავლობაში მუშაობდა საქართველოს მთავრობაში, კერძოდ იყო ეკონომიკის მინისტრის მოადგილე, განვითარების მინისტრის მოადგილე, ასევე მრჩეველი პრემიერ-მინისტრის სწორედ ეკონომიკური პოლიტიკის საკითხებში და ის ხელმძღვანელობდა ასევე საქართველოს მოლაპარაკებებს საერთაშორისო საგარეო ეკონომიკურ ურთიერთობების ჭრილში მოლაპარაკებებს, მაგალითად თავისუფალი ვაჭრობის რეჟიმის შესახებ, თავისუფალი სავაჭრო სივრცის შესახებ მოლაპარაკებებში ევროკავშირთან მონაწილეობდა და ასევე ხელმძღვანელობდა საქართველოს უბრალოდ ხელმძღვანელობდა საქართველოს დელეგაციას რუსეთის მოლაპარაკებებში მსოფლიო სავაჭრო ორგანიზაციაში გასაწევრებლად არსებულ მოლაპარაკებებში. ქალბატონი თამარი ასევე გახლავთ, როგორც მოგეხსენებათ, მან მიიღო განათლება ევროპაში, ასევე დაიწყო დისერტაცია, რამდენიმე მიმართულებით ეკონომიკა, პოლიტიკა, გერმანიაში, ჰაიდელბერგში და ასევე ბრიუსელში თავისუფალ უნივერსიტეტში. ეხლა პირდაპირ გადავალში ჩვენს ექსპერტებთან მე მგონია კითხვებს არ დავუსვამთ, იმიტომ რომ მივცეთ საშუალებას ექსპერტებს რომ გააკეთოთ თავის შესწავლილი, თემა ცნობილია, ეს არის რა თქმა უნდა ეჯობია პრივატიზაცია. მადლობთ. რა თქმა უნდა თემა არის ცნობილი, თემა არის ძალიან აქტუალური. პირველი მე გადავიდოდი ბატონ მაიკლ ემერსონთან და ის ისაუბრებს სწორედ ევროკავშირის პოლიტიკაზე ჩვენი რეგიონის მიმართ, საქართველოს მიმართ, ალბათ ასევე ისაუბრებს იმ საკითხებზე, რომელიც დღეს ძალიან მწვავედ დგას, ეს არის მთლიანად რეგიონის არამედ საქართველოს მაგრამ უკრაინის საკითხი და ასევე თუნებად მოლდოვა, ყველა ის ქვეყანა, აღმოსავლეთის პარტნიორების ქვეყანა, რომელიც დღეს მიისწრებს ევროპისკენ და როგორ ხედავს ის თქვათ აი ამ რეგიონში დასტაბილურებას მდგომარეობის, როგორ ხედავს ევროპული ინტეგრაციის პროცესის განვითარებას, სწორედ აი რუსეთთან კავშირში და რუსეთის აი ამ პოზიციების ფონზე. გთხოვთ ბატონო მაიკლ.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Tbilisi for some very specific reasons. I have been here for quite a number of years, and I've been walking around Tbilisi on this beautiful day this morning, and have been observing how your beautiful city has become even more beautiful since I was last here. I've been admiring some of the new architectural creations, the bridge, and then the new theatre, which has become gigantic trumpets. And I like it. I think it's good. Right. Also, it's a very great pleasure, particularly also because Tamara and Sergey, I've known both of them for many years, and I'd just like to add a couple of words of introduction, but then which adds to what you said. Tamara, very simple. She's well known in Brussels because of her negotiating work, and she became a very seriously respected negotiating partner with the European Union, doing her work for Georgia in an extremely professional way. For Sergey, now some of you may have not been, I've known him for 25 years, and the first time I met him was in 1990, when I went to Moscow, when the European Union was beginning to say hello to the Soviet Union and wanting to try to save Gorbachev. And we met a number of young men I mean, Sergey still looks fairly young, but he was 25 years younger then, together with Gaidar, who were preparing, at Tbilisi, who were preparing the then called 500 Days program in order to have a real reform program of the Soviet Union. Then of course it came Russia later. So quite a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since then. Now, coming straight to the business now, I'd like to speak to three themes. The first one is Georgia will, on the 27th of June, sign the DCFTA and association agreement with the EU, and so how to make a success of that. Second theme, and the third one, they both come to the Russian question. So the second theme is how bad has it got? And the third theme is how positive could it become? So, first of all, on Georgia. Day one, a lot of customs duties will be suppressed by the European Union, so your exporters have a better opportunity there. There's the question of whether Georgia will have to further reorient its exports towards Europe if Russia goes on with certain types of restrictive trade policies. For example, for the wine sector, where wine may again become a health hazard for the Russian population. In that case, can you sell it all in Europe, or can you sell difference in Europe? I think the main point here is actually, Tamara will correct me if I'm wrong, I think effectively they're not quantitative restrictions. It's really all a question of quality and marketing. And so get on with it. I mean, the opportunities are there, but Georgian wine is not on sale in the Brussels supermarkets yet, although there's a lot of stuff from Chile, Bulgaria, and many other places. So that is something to be done. Now, coming to the DCFTA itself, I'm sure Tamara will speak more about this. There's a huge amount of new legislation that Georgia will take on in order to replicate and implement at home here in Georgia EU law, market law, basically. So there is a very important question, is whether this mass of EU law fits well with the needs of Georgia, particularly after the radical liberalizing and deregulating reforms of the previous government. This is a controversial issue and has to be looked at very, very carefully. We don't have time now to go into the detail of it because there's a huge amount of detail. But I would just say the following thing. Within the EU itself, this issue of whether Brussels is over-regulating or not, this is a much debated issue. But to my mind, what you have to stick to as the main story is that within the European Union, you have a whole collection of countries, all of whom are applying EU law more or less correctly. Some of them manage to have extremely liberal and dynamic economies and sophisticated ones, let us say Denmark, UK is very liberal, but then Belgium, where I live now, is a much more heavily regulated country and a rather inefficiently regulated country with respect to small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, the main point of my story here is that you can still choose what you want to be. Basically, there's a mass of legislation on various aspects of EU law, but you can still, it seems to me, go ahead with your lightly regulated economy, the business sector. Okay, that leads into my fourth and final point on Georgia. How can Georgia make a great success of this new chapter in its European relations? I think Georgia has already achieved great branding success. Georgia brand means ease of doing business. the world. Okay, that's an achievement. Second achievement is maybe slightly more recent. Georgia identifies a certain business niche of being a commercial hub between Europe and for the whole of the Caucasus, the South Caucasus, and into Central Asia, and on with new transport routes through Kazakhstan into China. I think this is a very, very valid niche, and you have actually the opportunity to go even further and combine that with what one might call Georgia in Europe brand. What I mean by that is that you clearly can do this in a way that your other two South Caucasian states cannot do. Armenia has taken the choice to join the Russian Customs Union, which in my opinion is a poor choice economically, though they have reasons for having accepted it. And so they are out for that reason. And Baku and Azerbaijan, I mean, it's all about oil and huge wealth generated by that, but that is also means very high costs and limitations on its opportunities to do what Georgia is wanting to do. The further level to this that I'm sure many of you are thinking about is how further to mark out Georgia's brand or economic niche specializations. And maybe there's something to think about here in relation to the digital economy. Now the Baltic states are the same size as yours. They go down this track, and Estonia has done brilliantly well in becoming a highly high-tech digital economy. And this goes with a very important new economic paradigm that the supply chains in the world, which you want to get connected with, are now being fragmented and dispersed because of this huge phenomenon of digital or IT connectivity. Everybody's connected with everybody. And it means that precise geographic location, if you have the right skills, doesn't matter quite so much. It may be here, if you get your educational institutions and training institutions producing the right kind of people, then you can develop some future-oriented business niche. So lots to go for there, and the starting point, I think, is already very positive. Okay, now Russia and how bad has it become? Now this is a very sad story because many of us in the last 2 decades, many of us in Western Europe have got to know Russia quite well. Have many friends there, and more than friends in terms of family relationships. So we know Russia quite well. We spent these last 25 years imagining that Russia would be kind of gradually normalizing, when we use that term, from a European perspective. But what has been happening in the last year or two, and certainly the last 6 months, has been a little worse than that. Now, so we've reached the stage that the EU and US are applying sanctions, and the G7 meeting, along with G8 yesterday in Brussels, announced that unless the Kremlin does more to get the Russians or proxy Russians out of Donetsk, there will be more economic sanctions. So now we have to analyze, we try to analyze what's going on there in the Kremlin. Thinks, well, see what it is doing, what is it thinking about, and what we do next. Is it war? Well, we can have a seminar on the question, what is war precisely? So I skipped that. But let's say we notice economic punishment towards Ukraine, propaganda war, military annexation of Crimea, and covert intervention in Donetsk. So if that's not a war, well, okay, we skip the semantics. But is it justified? Because of the risk to the lives of Russians and Russian compatriots? Well, no, the answer is obviously no. Something happened here which the opportunistic politics from the Kremlin, which was able to annex Crimea rather easily, but that doesn't make it justified in international views. Now, the question is, what next? Putin softened his line a bit about 2.5 weeks ago when he said he thought it was a good idea that he had to have the presidential election. And it was open for interpretation as to how significant that gesture was. Unfortunately, the follow-through to that would have to be trying harder to get the Russian paramilitaries out of Donetsk, and he actually has not done that. And so the problem remains. And the other thing that we notice, and I watch Russian television a lot in Brussels, Russian language television, all Russian programs, and so and maybe some of you do here as well. But the nature of the public propaganda campaign is overwhelming. And I have observed how many young, highly educated, young professional Russian people seem to be buying it. Okay, dreadful story. Now, how positive could it be? Now, the turning point could be if the Kremlin were to back off Donetsk, try hard, there's been a coup d'etat in Donetsk in the last days. A guy called Volodai, who's a Russian from Moscow, is the new prime minister there, etc., etc. He should go home, for God's sake, and let the Ukrainians sort things out themselves. This would require a relatively small modification of the Russian position, because if that was done, then the way would be open for what the Europeans would actually like. That is to say, some new deal in this wider European space between the EU, Russia, including also the DCFTA countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, in between. What could this deal consist of? Well, to be helpful to the Kremlin, Poroshenko has said that the majority of the Ukrainian population do not think it would be a good idea to join NATO. Okay. Russia would like Ukraine to be neutral, about this story, but the Ukraine situation is different. Public opinion is different in Ukraine. So do something on that. Constitutional reform of the language regime. Well, frankly, this Russian language question in Ukraine is the easiest thing to solve with goodwill. We have in Europe so many cases of bilingual or multilingual countries with minority rights which are satisfied in different ways for what language you can speak in the town hall, in the public media. And it's the easiest problem to solve in Ukraine, in principle, because the Ukrainian and Russian languages are close brothers. I come from Belgium, I live in Belgium. French and Flemish are completely different languages. In the Ukrainian case, it's easy. So do something on that. Now, the next thing, the EU should be willing, and it now begins to accept a Russian argument to enter into trilateral negotiations on important issues between Ukraine and Russia. And up until now, the EU has said, no thank you, we don't trust the idea. But actually, this is beginning to happen now. The Energy Commissioner from Brussels is now in conversation with the Russian and Ukrainian energy ministers over the price of gas and the debt repayments. So that's a good starter. I mean, clearly it has come to the absolutely obvious point. Russia, up until now, is still asking for $468 meters, compared to Germany, which pays about 350, and I believe that China now, in this new big deal, is also paying about 350. So this is a monopolistic extortion. It doesn't work. It's unsustainable. So for God's sake, settle for an index gas price for Ukraine, index on the German price, less transport, discounts, and just get the gas price out of politics once and for all. Then would be the question of the relationships between the DCFTA partners, the EU and Russia. Now, are there issues here? And I know Tamara is very interested and qualified on this question. Are there questions as to how, let us say, Ukrainian trade policy towards Russia should evolve in a more positive cooperative setting? And here, I would say the EU should be quite willing to have trilateral conversations, Ukraine, Russia and the EU, as to whether the DCFTA has any unintended harmful effects, legitimate harmful effects on Russia. And then one can go on, if all of this begins to happen, you can go on and have some new agreement between Russia and the EU. And then finally, you've got the Lisbon to Vladivostok process, using Putin language there. I say yes, absolutely. Hell of a good idea. The EU should have a well-negotiated free trade agreement, but absolutely not customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And that means also discussing the wider European economic space of which includes, therefore, also Ukraine, Russia, and North. So that's the agenda, not for tomorrow, but for some time down the road, if there can be now, in the next days, literally, some strategic shift out of this conflict paradigm into a cooperation paradigm. I think one can see how it's absolutely obvious to any sane person that the cooperative paradigm could have huge advantages over the present deplorable situation of conflict.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emerson. I will not make lots of comments because we had a Q&A session after all three presentations. I just wanted to note one thing. You said that you do not know whether this is war or not in Ukraine, but at least it's an aggression because UN formulation or UN determination of the aggression says that even if one country is attacked using just mercenaries and paramilitaries, or letting paramilitaries to pass from their territory to another territory, then this is already understood as an aggression. Another thing also is if one country lets another country through its territory to start war against another country, so country also is an aggression. So in this case, we see the whole big chains of vehicles, armed vehicles, and including the big soldiers, etc. They pass the Russian border and they go to Ukraine to fight there in Donetsk, etc. They are not official Russian troops, but it doesn't matter for the term of aggression. It means that Russia produces the act of aggression against Ukraine. So this is my present. And let's go further into real debates concerning DCFTA and possibility of the free trade between customs union, Eurasian customs union and European Union and its partners, which is a very interesting issue. But let's first to go to Mr. Aleksashenko and ask him to provide his perspective, his view about all these topics, Russia, EU, and Georgia, and the region in general. Thank you.
First time I was in Tbilisi, really 25 years ago, 26 years ago, I was not in 1988. At that time, I was the Academy of Science in the UCSI Research Institute. And in Tbilisi, there was such an enterprise, I don't know how to produce it in English, Fabrika Knuty-Nebeli. Knuty-Nebeli. It's that is making around. And that was something that you should know, but that was the enterprise that used one of the modernized models of Russia. And that's why I was sent here by the government of Russia, saying, hey, look what they are doing, try to help us understand this useful. I'm really thankful for organizing this event and for such an opportunity to be here to be in my city. I really wonder why Russia is a part of this debate. Russia and Europe, they are neighbors. And if we were to put the question, do Russia-Europe economic relations have future? The answer is, of course, yes. Do Russia-European economic relations have a bright future? Of course, no. Look, and it's historically, Russia is a European country. Russia is a part of European history, at least since mid-18th century. For more than 250 years, Russia is a part of European history, wars, peace, and war, peace, and so on. Europe is a natural neighbor of Russia and the main trading partner, historically. Oil and gas pipelines are the key elements of mutual economic interdependence. And neither of our sides, nor Russia nor Europe, cannot remove those pipelines and can substitute them immediately by something else. Hydrocarbons, oil, gas, petrochemicals, is more than 70% of Russian economy. Can Europe live without Russian oil and gas? Maybe, but not immediately, not tomorrow. It requires tens of billions of euros, and that is the decade, to build a new oil and LNG terminals, to organize petrochemical capacities, refineries, because of different composition of subsidies, Russian oil, Arab oil, and so on. Can Russia survive without European market? Can Russian oil and gas industry survive without European market? Probably. It requires time and money as well. And I really wonder why, for example, Russian authorities, they have implemented Mikhail Khodorkovsky idea and built a oil pipeline to China, but they cannot build oil pipeline to Murmansk. Murmansk is on the north of Russia, but it is non-freezing deep water port. And there you can receive the hugest oil tankers of the world, fill them with Russian oil, and sell anywhere in the world. So that theoretically is possible. But do both sides, Russia and Europe, need this completely? Because it's natural that oil and gas, they are more or less tradable goods in the common market, in the current world. And of course, Russia will be a natural resources dependent country. Russia will produce oil, gas, metals, everything of that, and will sell it some way in the world. And because of that, Russia will be dependent on import of many things, starting from components, from petrochemicals, starting from equipment, vegetable foods, food stuff, some others, cars, everything else. And Russian import logistics is organized in such a way that we import the bulk of the stuff to St. Petersburg or to Finnish ports and then transport them by railroads or cars to Moscow. And Moscow is the biggest distribution hub for the rest of the country. Can it be modernized immediately? For example, let's forget about Europe. Let's make our import hub through Vladivostok. It will be much more expensive. And it's illogical because the bulk of Russian population is that they didn't get the European power. And that's why I believe that that is the natural future of Russian and European economic relations. So nothing can be done. Europe can try to reduce its dependence from Russian gas. But once again, it's not cheap. And Russian Gazprom will sell this gas to Europe in the current amounts, not less, because all the plans of Europe are based on the growing consumption of gas. This is growing consumption will be substituted or will be imported from other parts of the world. But when I say that Russia and Europe have no bright economic future, I think there is a key problem, because under President Yeltsin in the 90s, Russia has signed a political partnership and cooperation, and in fact, Russian political elite were ready to move rather fast towards some type of article monetary, some type of real integration with Europe. But Europe was not ready for such a radical shift. And Europe said, okay, stop, guys. Partnership agreement on partnership and cooperation, that's it. Let's make it do. You are a country in transition, blah, blah, blah. So, and that was the moment when Russia would make a radical change of its economic policy, of its political policy, if I'm not mistaken. But later on, under President Putin, this desire has been eliminated or disappeared somewhere in the air. But until 2006-2007, especially as the previous partnership agreement has expired, Russian authorities were looking for a new framework of agreement. There were discussions on a new basic agreement. But no one side, neither Europe nor Russia, were able to define the common goals. And the critical changes, in my mind, took place in the global crisis, during the global crisis of 2007-2009, when Russian President Putin, I will many times use his name, because we have a country that is, whose policy is defined by one person. That's why his mentality, his thinking is really crucial to understand what's going on in Russia. So in the crisis of 2007-2009, Putin has recognized and concluded that the Western model, free market economy plus democratic institutions, has come to its end. The Western model has no future. That is the collapse. The crisis that happened 5 years ago is the collapse of the Western model. And that's why Russia should not follow this way. Because if it is at the end of the road, if we see the end of the road, what's the reason to go the same way? And starting from this time, in many of his speeches and presentations, the idea of the third way emerged. And that's why, after the crisis, the idea of this Eurasian Economic Union became publicized first in the Kremlin and then in the rest of the around Russia space. That is the reason. And currently, and after that time, from 2009, let's say, until Crimean crisis, Russia-EU relations, they were a huge victory of bureaucracy on both sides. The European Union has its own bureaucracy, Russia is a country of bureaucracy as well. So there were summits on the level of President of the Commission, President of Russia twice a year. Government of Russia, Commission of Europe regular meetings, Permanent Council of different ministers, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Economy of Affairs, regular Permanent Council of the Partnership meeting, Partnership for Modernization. A lot of job, a lot of preparatory job, meetings, but no progress at all. And if I ask why the time, what is the problem? My answer is rather simple. Integration with Europe means more comprehensive integration rather than economic. It is integration in all spheres of your life. Any country dreaming about integration with Europe should recognize that you are really giving up the part of your sovereignty to Brussels borders. That is really far from here. And you cannot influence this progress. For ordinary people, normally they don't care at the beginning. Because at the beginning, people from the Eastern Europe, they dream about the bright future that some years later will be like the Western Europe. But later on, this enthusiasm disappears and people want real achievements, real results. But in Russia, the problem was that full membership of the European Union for Russia both sides at the moment. Russia, for Europe, Russia is too big. And for Russia, Russia is never ready to give up the body of its sovereignty. And that's why I don't believe in the bright future of Eurasian Economic Union, because if Eurasian Union wants to follow the way of the European Union, there should be some supranational bureaucracy emerge, and some delegation of political responsibilities, of political power should move to this level. What are other opportunities for Russia with Europe? Special trade regime, free trade area. Look, as I said in the beginning, trade relations between Russia and Europe are inevitable. We will trade one another, and we have no choice. But can those relations be more efficient, less costly? Yes, but propensity to go this way is not symmetrical on both sides. The bulk of Russian export is not covered by European tariffs. Neither oil, no gas, no metals, no wood. So if you calculate all commodities, raw materials, and some primary products of Russian export, it's more than 85%. So theoretically, no more than 15% of Russian export, if you use everything from grain to armament, is covered by, it may be covered by tariffs. So the propensity to reduce this tariff inside Russian economy is very small. And that was precisely the reason why WTO negotiations for accession to WTO was not supported in Russian business community. Because the bulk of the business receives its profit and is outside of the WTO, outside of the tariffs. It's raw material. For the European part, of course, the free trade area is more attractive, but Putin as a politician, he has permanently a zero-sum game in his mind. In any negotiations, he believes that any of your gives up is the win of the opposite side. So if Europe wants reduction of tariffs or elimination of tariffs or free trade zone, and it is in favor of Europe, and Russia is losing something. And that's why he was suspicious in WTO negotiations. Everyone trusted him. Obama, Merkel, Medvedev, Russian business. Why do you trust him? If Obama wants him to be a member of WTO, it's beneficial for Obama, for the United States, and it's not beneficial for Russia. And that's why free trade area theoretically possible, but no big propensity on Russian side. Any improvement on the investment climate in Russia for European business only, but all other businessmen from all other countries of the world should leave the current corrupting environment with no rule of law. It's that's not an option. And big European business, in fact, has adjusted itself to Russian realities and is more or less happy. But big European business, mostly German, French, Italian, they gain a huge amount of money. They invested a lot into Russia, and that's why they're strong opponents to anything further sanctions to Russia, because they will lose their market positions. They don't want to lose Russian market. Theoretically, there is another option in the economy. It's Russia as a technological partner. There are some failed cases where Russia wanted Russian businessmen wanted technological cooperation with Western class, with Europeans or Americans, like Kovziridze, but those transactions were prohibited, for example, by Kremlin. There are some others that are more less successful, like titanium producer SNO, who produces titanium details for Airbus and Boeing, which are part of the airplanes, and after us became the Marva case Sergey, but it became a partner, a member of the Renault-Nissan Alliance. And for example, the next platform for the Renault-Nissan car of P/C level for all markets except of Western Europe will be, is being designed in Russia. So the next platform of the French-Japanese car was designed in Russia. It's in fact Russian. So Russia can be a technological partner. There are some opportunities, but there are rare cases, and of course it's not an issue on the top political level. China. Can Russia say, okay, bye-bye Europe, we are moving to China? Because China is once again is a big trading partner. As a single country, when I tell you, say Europe is a bloc European Union. And China is the biggest trading partner in Russia as a single country. But the structure of trade flows is very similar to European. Natural resources go from Russia to China, and equipment and finished products are going from China to Russia. And there is a technology flow. In European case, we receive some technologies from Europe, but in China situation, technology currently is going from Russia to China as a part of military and nuclear contracts. China is enormously important for Russia in developing Far East and Eastern Siberia, because China is a national demand for natural resources, and China is a source of financing of all those developments. But Russia will partly benefit from these developments because a very small part of Russian population is there. For example, we know about this China-Russia gas deal and the gas pipeline going to China. But if you look on the map of this pipeline, you will see that there are no any Russian cities nearby. So this 2,500 kilometers pipeline is going in inhabited territories with no Russian consumers of the gas. So all gas is going to China, and of course Russia will benefit some on investment in development of the gas field, but it's something like 0.2% of GDP every year within 5 years. In fact, it's nothing. It's like a statistical error. And that's why I don't think that Russia can really go to China. China is the competitor to Russia among the developing economies, and China is a successful competitor. Today, if we look on the China export to Russia, approximately 50% of Chinese export to Russia are equipments and machinery building, different types. In Russian export to China, less than 1%. That's how the competition between Russia and China is taking place, and that's why I do not see how Russia and China may cooperate being competitors. And what about Georgia? Georgia is, first of all, I want to congratulate Georgia that in 3 weeks it will become at least part of DCFTA agreement. So it's a really big achievement, and I believe that for Georgia it's a right decision, and it is continuation of your transformation process to the civilized world. But is it a threat to Putin? Is it a threat to Russia? In my mind, no. In my mind, even today, the economic relations and trade between Russia and Georgia, they are negligible. On Russian side, they are negligible. On Georgia's side, they are a little bigger, but not crucially important. Putin is much more, and definitely he is afraid of the NATO extension rather than of European economic integration. And in some of his recent speeches, implicitly Putin said that his fear Ukraine becomes a part of NATO was the reason why Crimea was annexed. So he was afraid. Look, we may debate everything, but that's his fear, that's his phobia, that's his problem. So as soon as Ukraine is not dependent on Russia, as soon as Ukraine signs any agreement with the European Union, some months or some years later Ukraine joined NATO, and after that American military base is in Sevastopol. That's what is in his mind. Yeah, and we have to do this. So, and of course, he said some phrases that he is afraid of free trade area between Ukraine and the European Union, and that will allow Russian authorities to impose some trade tariffs or some restrictions on Ukrainian import to Russia, export to Russia. Though I do not believe it's really possible for all types of export. And being in Georgia's shoes, I would be more or less reluctant to find that Russian consumers, they are sophisticated and they receive quality. If there is a quality and there is a way for the products to go to Russian market, even when embargo or sanitary restrictions on Persian and Georgian wire were imposed, it was possible to buy both of them in Moscow. Although sometimes quality was sometimes not. quality was not good. But today, as Germany is allowed to be trade in Russia, every Russia should stand. So Russian consumers know what is quality, and I believe that if Georgia follows the way of transformation, of course the quality of Georgian goods will grow up. And the last phrase, 25 years ago, transformation in Eastern Europe has started. In the beginning of May, just a month ago, there was a meeting of former reformers from Eastern European countries in Budapest, and the conclusion of this meeting was that major reforms are done before you join the European Union. As soon as you join the European Union, there is no further reforms. So you have some time ahead, and you should use it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will be in reforms during 20 years, I think, ahead. Thank you. Very interesting. And what I would like to remind just that in 2003, when European neighborhood policy started, Russia was offered to join European neighborhood policy, even that period, and Russia refused. And then I remember that Petersburg Agreement, how it is called, process started, and Russia signed this four spaces agreement. So there was still chance at that time for Russia and European Union to go together in some direction. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. You will describe the last 5 years development. Thank you. And we will then return with a Q&A session. And now let me to ask Tamara Kovziridze to make her presentation.
Thanks a lot. The title of my presentation today is DCFTA between the European Union and Georgia and its costs and benefits. And the reason why I selected such a title and why I want to focus on this is that I think we should be aware of the benefits of this very important agreement as well as the challenges associated with it. And I want to talk about it. So generally, I'm a big supporter of free trade, of liberal economic relations, and of this free trade agreement in particular. Nevertheless, I want all of us to be aware of the challenges or potential costs that Georgia will have to face and will have to bear on the road towards implementation of the DCFTA. So when we look back at the road that Georgia went through until the anticipated date of signature, probably it's worthwhile mentioning that actually it was Georgia who proposed first the free trade agreements to the European Union, and this was in 2005. So back then, the Eastern Partnership policy of the European Union did not exist, and therefore it was not anticipated in Brussels or any of the EU member capitals that one day they could have a free trade agreement with any of the post-Soviet countries. Of course, Baltics excluded, because Baltics at that stage already had their association agreements and free trade agreements, and they were on the way, they were already members, and they were on the way of implementing those membership obligations. So in the rest of the post-Soviet Union space, no one thought actually that this was a possibility or a specific perspective, because normally if countries conclude a free trade agreement with each other, this is a message about the relevance and the meaning of their political relations. Free trade agreements are not concluded just like that, and it is rather an exception. It's not a rule in trade relations. There are fewer countries that have free trade agreements. Most of the countries don't have free trade agreements with each other. So this proposal of Georgia was very shocking to Brussels. And I was part of the process from the beginning, and I remember one of the high-level officials of the European Commission, one of the commissioners, telling to the then Georgian Prime Minister that, you have to think very well about it, because the impact of this agreement can be devastating for your market. there will be influx of European goods suddenly, and what will you do with your own producers and small businesses? And of course that argument back then was not convincing for Georgia, because we had already endorsed a very liberal economic and trade policy, and the government had decided to unilaterally zero almost all tariffs. So that meant that these tariffs would be zero for European goods, for Chinese goods, or any other goods. So we very stubbornly pursued this path, and then when we signed the Neighborhood Policy Action Plan, very vaguely the DCFTA was included there as a perspective. This was in November 2006, and what that document said was that it was possible to conclude such an agreement sometime in the future, maybe, but first there needed to be a detailed, comprehensive feasibility study. First, we needed to identify whether this is good or bad at all, right? And back then also the concept of this deep and comprehensive free trade agreement did not exist. So all we were asking for was a simple free trade agreement. What it means is that you basically either abolish or dramatically reduce tariffs, import tariffs and trade. That's why it's called simple. So it didn't have any regulatory approximation component. Such free trade agreements were not concluded back then by the European Union. So to sum up, basically it took almost 10 years from the moment Georgia took the initiative and initiated this discussion with Brussels in 2005 until now, when we are finally at the point where we are signing the agreement. And in between, what happened in between was first a detailed feasibility study, then more than 2 years of preparatory process with 27 pages, list of preconditions, everything that we needed to do to start negotiations, and then the negotiating process, which actually was relatively swift compared to all the process before that. And now the agreement is, I think, almost ready for signature and translated probably already in all the official languages of the European Union, which are many because there are 28 member countries there. Now, what is this agreement for us and what it means for us? First, I want to focus on what benefits we will see from it. And it is definitely an agreement that substantially changes the quality and the level of our relations, because it's a long-term one. Okay, so now we have a special trade regime with the European Union. This is one-sided trade preferences from the EU to Georgia, which is only for 3 years, and it is renewed every 3 years. So if a foreign investor or a local investor wants to produce a good and has in mind that it has to be exported to the European Union, the preferences are short-term, so it's difficult to make long-term plans and projections based on that. In contrast to the current scheme, DCFTA is an agreement forever. So unless something horrible happens, unless we do something horrible, this will not be abolished, right? So this is an agreement forever. It's a long-term agreement because, as I said, it took us almost 10 years to get where we are, and the implementation regime of such agreements is such that until we fully implement it, it will take us probably another 8 years. Because there are plenty of obligations for Georgia. It's an agreement that is about 1,000 pages, and it takes time to do it, but I will come back to this. So, and then it is an agreement that has an enormous political relevance. Even though we might think, as my colleague said, that Russia is not worried about economic relations and it is more worried about security and NATO expansion is something more sensitive, the events in Ukraine demonstrated that Russia does worry about EU integration as well, because Ukraine had said before, and it repeated it later as well, that it doesn't want to join NATO, it wants to become closer to the European Union, but still we all witnessed what happened there and how big a problem it became for Ukraine. So the price that Ukraine had to pay for its wish to be part of the European space is very high, right? say the least, it's Crimea. So it is an agreement that has political importance. It tells something about the type of relations that the EU and Georgia will have, because as I said, countries that don't consider themselves politically as important partners don't conclude normally free trade agreements, even if they think that economically it is beneficial. So trade is something very politicized and political. In the short term, the benefits of the agreement are more political and less economic, to be frank with you. And only in the medium and long term we will see economic benefits from this agreement. Why? Because we need to do our work to implement the agreement. And unless we implement the agreement gradually, it will be hard for us, for example, to increase our export to the European Union. Why? Because the formula that on which the agreement is based is the following. The objective of this agreement is that Georgia becomes integral part of the European Union internal market. Now, as some of you may know, that internal market is based on four freedoms, four basic principles. This is free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. So free movement of people will be realized through the visa-free regime that we will hopefully have with the European Union within the next 2 years. All the remaining three freedoms are realized by the DCFTA. So this is free movement of goods, free movement of services, and free movement of capital. And the basic attitude of Brussels in this business is that we will let you become part of our market, part of our economy. We will let you have all the benefits from it that maybe EU members or their citizens have, but for that you have to become like us. Only then you can fully integrate in that market. And this becoming like us process is of course challenging, because for this there is a whole body of EU, the so-called EU acquis, the European Union legislation, its directives and regulations, that Georgia has to transpose in its own legislation. It's challenging to do it quickly, and we are not asked to do it quickly. We are not asked to do it overnight, within a year or even 2. So the maximum period within which we can do it is 10 years. So there are very sensitive, complicated, tricky areas in the association agreement and DCFTA for which we took the obligation to do it only maybe in 8 years or 6 years. So the moment we approximate our legal framework with the European Union, then it will become easier to export products to the EU. For example, if our food safety system works more or less like it works in the European Union, only then it will be easier for our, for example, dairy producers to bring their products to the EU market. So it will take time. Therefore, I'm saying that the economic benefits of this agreement, we should be realistic about it, will not come quickly. So when we sign the agreement, when it enters into force, of course it will not happen that on day one, everyone who produces something in Georgia can easily export to the European Union. This will be a process. Now, we studied experience of different countries, and of course this regulatory adjustment means compliance cost for businesses, and this has been the experience of newly acceded members, of different other members that have similar agreements with the European Union. So it is important for us to be well aware of that, because at the end of the day, it will be Georgia's government which has to carry the regulatory cost related to creating new institutions, adopting new laws, developing new procedures. All this is procedures and institutions that make Georgia's regulatory environment more similar to that of the European Union. And on the other hand, there will be, of course, adjustment costs related for the business community, because they have to adjust to these new regulations, and that might mean cost for them. Therefore, it is provided in the agreement that it can be implemented not within a year, but let's say within 10 years. The basic challenge, in my point of view, on this road of implementation of the agreement is, and it's not only typical for Georgia, but this is the challenge that many governments face throughout their EU integration process, is that governments tend to overdo the obligations. So they do more than is required, and the reasons for this are different. And what it means to do more is that sometimes they introduce more regulation than is needed, or more regulation that is maybe not so favorable for business community and business representatives. So governments in this process tend to increase their role in economic processes, and that is not always positive, of course. And I think Georgia should be particularly attentive to this, because in the past years, Georgia liberalized its business environment tremendously. There were many reforms that were conducted, as my Russian colleague rightly said, you better do it before you come closer to the EU, because when you, the closer you come, the more regulation you will have to introduce, and that more regulation sometimes means bigger role of state institutions in economic processes. And what businesses actually prefer is to be left on their own. They will deal with it. They don't like too much interference and too high role of the government. So reforms associated with DCFTA for Georgia will be something like a second big wave of reforms. As Michael rightly mentioned, there are ways to do those reforms in smart form and in smart manner. Different countries have different experience. For us, the major challenge is to, on the one hand, comply with the preconditions or the obligations that we have, and on the other hand, to maintain the comparative advantage that we have been trying to create for us, the easy business environment that is attractive for local businesses, but also for foreign investors, because we do depend economically on FDI to create sufficient jobs in the country. And there are ways there as well to be creative. For example, I mentioned earlier that it was quite shocking for the European Union when we said that we want to have a free trade agreement with you. And I think the second biggest shock in this process for them was when Georgia proposed to fully abolish tariffs. So at some point in negotiations, we had to exchange the so-called tariff offers. So you offer the European Union to what extent do you want to open market to their goods, and they do the same to you, right? So we sent simply a two-sentence proposal that we propose to you not to have any tariff at all. And I don't think they had received any similar proposal from anyone, because at that particular moment they had hard negotiations with Ukraine, because Ukraine wanted to maintain tariffs on their machinery production. They didn't want to open a market for European Union machinery products, and then European Union said, okay, but we then won't open the agriculture market for you, and both became very stubborn, and this was like the bone of contention. Same in Moldova, same in other countries, so tariff talks are something very hard. The negotiating parties don't like it, and we just said, okay, whatever you want to propose to us, we tell you that there will be no tariffs from our side. And you know what they did? They sent us the same type of proposal. And actually yesterday I met my former counterpart in this negotiation, so the chief negotiator of EU-Georgia DCFTA. He told me that we tell to everyone that we have a revolutionary liberal free trade agreement with you, because there is no other country with which we don't have tariff. We either maintain tariffs on some goods, or we have the so-called tariff quotas, which means that you can trade tariff-free for a certain amount of goods. Funny enough, the only exception on the EU side is garlic. Not that we have that much garlic that we will invade the EU market, but garlic generally is a sensitive product on the EU market, because there is too much Chinese garlic apparently being imported, so they are very cautious. So garlic is not an exception. We can import certain amount of garlic, but there's a tariff quota. So for certain amount of garlic is tariff-free, and beyond exactly basically. And beyond that, you just have to pay the tariff that everyone else has to pay. So what I'm trying to explain is that if you are innovative, there are ways, even with heavy new regulation, to achieve quite liberal and even well, revolutionary or unprecedented outcomes. Just to conclude, DCFTA is an important project. It's politically very important. It's strategically important for us. Long term, it's economically extremely important because we will increase export and trade relations with the EU, and we will generate more FDI. We will become part of the EU market. But the basic challenge is to fulfill the obligations in such a way that we don't lose the comparative advantage that we have created in the past to be something like a regional hub, so with that objective. So maybe I can conclude here because I think I talked too much, but I hope I will receive some interesting questions from you and we can have a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Very, very comprehensive overview of Georgian negotiations with the European Union. I just remind one thing that actually talking about free trade, Georgia started even 20 years. It was during the period of negotiating partnership and cooperation agreement. For example, this Russia and Ukraine, the small clause saying that there is possibility of starting consultations on the possible free trade area between EU, future, yes, possibility. But already this question was, and I remember in 1999, Ukraine even, or 1998, Ukraine even requested officially European Union, based on this provision, to start consultations for free trade area. And we also asked Georgia, and the Georgian delegation also was asking to put the same, but they refused. So the European Union was very, very pessimistic about possibility of having free trade area with Georgia. And I really was surprised that we started negotiations 5 years ago on consultations on this. This is very big progress. Now let's turn to Q&A session, and we will start from this part, this right part, from my side, with the right hand, and then go to this. Yes, please.
Thank you. Kovziridze from the station of Georgia. So, first of all, thank you for the wonderful speeches and presentations you made. I have a question. Thank you, Tamara, for I fully share your liberal views on the Georgia's economy. And I fully agree also with you that it's arguable that the Russians, the Russia and Putin are not worried about the economic integration of Georgia towards the European Union. So, considering that we have now the Eurasian Union, and created, and also that Georgia is will sign the agreement of DCFTA association agreement. What do you think? How does all the participants? What do you think? How much and what would be the impact also of the risk of having the Russian market closed again, and also some economic relations difficulties with Kazakhstan and Belarus, and what kind of impact we could expect from that part? Because, as you mentioned in the beginning of your presentations, if you choose one of the factors of the foreign economic relations, you can have some also negative side effects because you became part of the Eurasian Union, some other economic groups.
Okay, start.
Yes.
Yes, on the Eurasian think basically the Eurasian Union is not going to have a great future as an economic project. It really needed Ukraine in it badly to be more than a bilateral Russian-Kazakh affair. However, the leadership of the Customs Union, and Russia in particular, is very keen indeed to get recognition for it. And so it is energetically trying to make free trade agreements with whoever would be kind enough to recognize this body. It presents some legal problems because Belarus and Kazakhstan are not yet members of the WTO, which presents in principle certain problems. And the EFTA countries, for example, are already in negotiation, several negotiating rounds with the Customs Union. And these progress is suspended now for Crimea reasons, but it's a different question. But they say we only anticipate signing this agreement when Belarus and Kazakhstan will have acceded also to the WTO. So in general, I would expect that the Customs Union, they will love to have free trade agreements with anybody in the rest of the world. I mean, the list includes New Zealand, which also has suspended its negotiations for the same reasons. And then there's Vietnam, another one, and the most exotic case of all is that free trade negotiations with Syria are proceeding rather positively. So anyway, leaving sarcasm on one side, I think sarcasm is heavily due in that particular case. I think it's quite an interesting issue, which I know Tamara has views on, as to whether Georgia and Ukraine, etc., should stick to their CIS trade agreements, or whether they should say, okay, this is a new situation, therefore let us have a free trade agreement with the Customs Union itself. And I think that is an interesting scenario to consider, but it's for you to decide what you want.
Thank you. Tamara, will you respond?
Just very briefly, so the Georgia's desire to trade more and be economically closer to the European Union should not mean that our trade relations deteriorate with customs union members. However, we know what kind of trade policy Russia has conducted with Georgia in the past years and with other countries in our neighborhood in the past years. For example, depending on who was in political leadership in Moldova, the trade embargo was on and off, right? And at different points in time, Russia has introduced trade embargo on Dutch tulips, Polish meat, United States poultry, the Danish milk products, the dairy products. So all these are quite high quality products. So the trade embargo here is a political decision, and it's not an economically motivated decision or economically justifiable decision. Because actually, now that Russia is in the WTO, Russia shouldn't tell us that, oh, I was so gentle, I opened my market to your goods. No, the WTO SPS agreement says actually that the way Russia introduced the embargo was counter those rules. So actually, the moment Russia entered that organization, it should have already lifted that embargo and not gradually like it did. Because that agreement says that you can introduce restriction on agricultural trade if that particular product is dangerous for your safety. It has to do nothing about quality, neither WTO nor EU regulation. Quality is something defined on the market based on the price and quality relationship. It's about safety. So it is impossible that for 7 years all Georgian agricultural products are so harmful that if Russians eat it, they will die. Okay, that's absurd, right? This is impossible because in parallel these products are exported to other markets, including the US and EU market, and nothing happens to Europeans and Americans. They haven't died. So normally, if you have an haven't died in 2 hours, you are fine. So practice shows that they have not died. So what I'm saying is that Russia's trade policy is highly political. It shouldn't, the EU-Georgia DCFTA shouldn't have an impact on Georgia's trade with customs union countries, but if there is a political decision to create some obstacles, that's a different thing. We also have free trade agreements with all CIS countries, bilateral agreements, and actually when Georgia left the CIS in 2008, we didn't leave the multilateral trade agreement in the CIS. We left, so to say, the political part of the CIS, but not the economic part of the regulatory base of the CIS. So it will be again a political decision. I will give you another example. Turkey and the European Union have a customs union, but I mean, we concluded free trade agreement with Turkey much earlier than we are concluding with the European Union. So in principle they have parallel trade policy, but things are not excluded. Georgia concluded FTA with Turkey in 2007. Only 7 years after that we are concluding. So it doesn't mean that when one country of the customs union does something, automatically the other has to do the same, although the Russian-led customs union is a bit different. It also is similar to, I mean, in that particular geographic space, what they are trying to do is to put a lot of regulatory and legislative obligations on potential members. For example, Kyrgyzstan now has a very long document about all it needs to do in the technical barriers to trade area and food safety area. It's almost like we were negotiating with the European Union. There is a very heavy legislative body in the customs union, and future members are required to do it. But also the fundamental difference between probably free trade with the EU and customs union is that if countries want to have free trade with the European Union, it's based on their free will. Many countries are just dragged into the customs union, and Kyrgyzstan and Armenia are a very good example of that. So there is a fundamental difference also on that level.
Thank you, Tamara.
First, I can agree with my Emerson saying that, of course, Mr. Putin, as a main ideologist of the Eurasian Union, would like to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union or with someone else, because for him, this means the acceptance of his new future. So the world accepts that he's not only Russia, but the Eurasian Union, that is a part of the international organization. So, unfortunately, Europe cannot sign a free trade agreement because of Belarus and Kazakhstan, but okay, that's another story, and Mr. Putin will never forgive this. And now he will remember, and every time it's okay, you block my idea, and you were the main enemy for my idea. And of course, Mr. Putin and Russia is not an easy trade negotiating partner. And of course, Russia will chase WTO rules many times with different countries. And because one of the ideas Putin repeats many times, that all countries violate WTO agreements. That's his favorite phrase. All violates agreements. And he will try to chase up to which limit it's possible to violate. Until he is judged by the WTO that he had violated, and that Russia has to pay penalties, he will do it. He will repeat this policy, and that's his destiny.
Thank you very much. I saw there were two people asking for questions. Yes, please.
I have a simple and straightforward question to Tamara. You said about different difficult reforms that we have to go through after the signing of the association agreement. So could you maybe give some examples of the reforms which would be most costly economically and politically?
Yes, in my point of view, probably the most costly reforms are in the agriculture sector. among others, because this is probably the most sensitive sector for Georgia, a sector in Georgia's economy which, if something is done in a wrong way, might have the strongest, let's say, social implications, because 50% of our labor force is employed there, and most of them are subsistence farmers, and there are many small companies. And the EU regulation, the so-called SPS area, it's called SPS, it means sanitary and phytosanitary standards, was drafted for a market that has 500 million inhabitants, and Georgia is still a small economy in the process of development. So there are specific regulations in the sector which require probably many businesses just to adjust their production process, as well as the way their enterprise is arranged. So it's related to upgrading physical infrastructure, because there have to certain rules have to be complied with, and a certain risk management system has to be established, as well as how the actual production process takes place, how waste management is done, how the ingredients that you need are purchased and tracked, from whom you have it. So there are all sorts of very technical things that I don't want to go into detail. But on the other hand, there are certain rules in the EU acquis which make it possible for you to have certain derogations and to have a relaxed, simple regulation for three types of companies. These are companies that produce small scale and supply to the local market. We have lots of these kind of companies, right, that produce, let's say, sulburi and bring it to the market of their village. So for them, the rules can be much simpler. For those that use traditional methods of production, like we will still be able to eat fingali. So to put it simply, that's what I mean, or produce truchella or cheese, which is like Gouda cheese. And that's important for European Union, because especially in the southern part, in Italy, France, we have lots of different types of products that they do want to preserve it. So those who use traditional methods of production, they can, the regulation is more relaxed. And the third category is companies that operate in geographically constrained areas, and that's then up to the country to define. And in our case, that can be high mountainous regions, for example, where the conditions are not so safe. So there are ways to navigate there, but that requires a high level of expertise from the people who are in charge of this legislative approximation, and the businesses have to have an understanding of that as well. So there are many technical requirements. I could talk for an hour about it, but I don't want to confiscate all the time that we have.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tamara. And any other question? Please. Yes.
Hi, my name is Reina Mukti. I'm a journalist. I wanted to ask this question. Recently, Russia's, I think, foreign ministry spokesman, he said that Georgia should expect certain consequences after signing the EU association agreement. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about this? I know it's all kind of, we will all be guessing, but what do you think those consequences might be? And also, one more question to kind of continue on what Tamara was just saying. How much, Tamara, this question is for you, I don't know if you're listening. I was just wondering, you know, it's clear that there will be quite a lot of pain for Georgian producers before they can see any gain. How much understanding do you think there is among Georgian producers about all these complex procedures that they will have to go through?
Who will respond first?
Okay. I cannot translate completely what Mr. Lukashenko said, because I believe that no one Russian leadership can imagine what Russia is going to do tomorrow. But I cannot promise easy life for Georgia. I think that some sanitary restrictions will be applied. maybe wine, maybe marjoram, maybe something else. But once again, despite there is a Eurasian Union, as I understand, sanitary restrictions will be applied by Russia only. So if you have good relations with Belarus and Georgia, you may violate or overpass those restrictions, export your goods to Belarus, like with marjoram, and from Belarus, marjoram will go to Moscow, to Russia. So this is it.
Thank you very much. Would you add or not, Mr. Emerson? No.
Yeah, there was a question about how much Georgian business community understands it. Yes, well, there have been throughout this period of time numerous information campaigns and one-on-one meetings with businesses or meetings in groups with specific sectors to explain. Like, I remember when I was chairing the negotiations, we even would discuss legislative drafts with groups of businesses just to make sure if they are able to implement it or when they are able to implement those specific regulations, and not to do anything that would be damaging rather than benefiting. But I mean, still, you can never stop providing information, right? And the EU acquis is so complex that probably few people know it to the greatest level of detail. I mean, maybe the lawyers or quality management managers in companies. So this will be a constant process. And of course, for bigger companies, it's easier to understand and comply with those rules than for smaller companies. So I see this as a rather an ongoing process throughout the entire period of implementation. And I know that EU ambassadors in Tbilisi, together with private sector representatives, have activated efforts. They even have come to our university to explain to students what it means. And they do a lot of promotion and information campaigns.
Thank you very much. I would add just that, and thank you to you, that there is a state program, or governmental program, for promotion of this FTA among the population, and it means that there are special also meetings envisaged with business community to explain all the
different languages, in minority languages.
And lots of donors. Yes. In addition, lots of donors are producing. Lots of donors, and not only business confederations, different kind of business communities. They are producing special booklets in order to make more available the legislation, new legislation, and new rules, etc. Technical regulations which come from the out of this DCFTA, etc. to the population. Thank you. And now, Mr. Emerson, please add.
A comment on this last question about agricultural regulations. Actually, there are 45 agricultural market regulations that were suggested by the European Commission, which Moldova said, yes, okay, no problem. And the Georgian negotiator, who's sitting, I believe, to my left, said, no thanks, we don't need these. And this was accepted. So the point is here that the Georgian side, although it's faced this huge Brussels bureaucracy, which works like a steamroller or a tank, actually the Georgian side is able to calibrate what it did and did not want to quite an effective degree.
Yes, thank you. And yes, please tell us.
Monica, I'm a journalist. Very briefly, we talked about the Eurasian Custom Union. My question is mainly related to Armenia. It was mentioned that Georgia has various free trade agreements with other countries, but the Eurasian Custom Union is much more restrictive in terms of which type of relations you can have with outsiders, which are not part of the Union. Georgia has a free trade agreement with Armenia, and the tariffs between the CFTA and the Custom Union are very different. Now, Armenia is an important partner for Georgia, not only for geographical reasons. Is that FTA going to be affected? Will it have to be renegotiate somehow, what will happen to it?
Okay, so the way it works is that FTA is, because it is an international agreement, is above the local trade regime. Now, for example, if Georgia has a specific tariff on certain goods, you have an FTA and you zero the tariff, it applies to the country with which you have the FTA, right? It does not apply to other countries. In the case of the customs union, normally it should be possible for Armenia to be part of the customs union and to maintain the free trade agreement, because it is possible for Kazakhstan, it is possible for Russia, and it is possible for Belarus. With all these countries, we trade under the free trade regime. So no one has said so far that we cannot maintain those regimes. And earlier I gave an example of EU-Turkey customs union and our free trade agreement with Turkey, which was not done in parallel with the EU free trade agreement, right? So we did have our own bilateral trade regime, and the customs union was not affected by it, and vice versa. So unless there is a political decision by the customs union members to create problems in trade with non-customs union member states, there shouldn't be a problem. Because now we trade duty-free under the free trade regime with Kazakhstan, with Belarus, and Russia as well. So why should Armenia be a problem unless there is a political decision to make it a problem? So I hope that answers your question. Was this what you wanted to know?
You have something to add?
Well, yeah, I had correct me if I'm wrong, I had an understanding that the original customs union required its members not to trade, not to have this agreement outside.
No, it doesn't, because as I told you, we do maintain our free trade agreements with current members. And even if they raise tariffs, that does not and should not apply to countries with whom they have FTAs. Because Kazakhstan already raised tariffs as a result of customs union membership. Armenia will have to raise, unfortunately, tariffs. Kyrgyzstan is very worried now that they have to raise the tariffs, but it shouldn't apply unless there is a political decision to instruct those countries by Russia that don't trade with Georgia or Moldova or Ukraine under the free trade regime. It would be very bad, but it would be a political decision, which we have seen similar decisions in the past, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. I will contradict a little bit. I have this right, Tamara. As regards to the customs unions, as usually, customs union requires from all member states having the same external tariffs among themselves, which means that ideally, member of the customs union cannot have free trade with anyone else unless full customs union has. Ideally. In our case with Turkey, it was the exception because European Union agreed with the Turkish government, saying that let's help the Georgian government and I give you permission as to the member of the customs union to make this return. If European Union forbidden to Turkey to sign with Georgia this agreement, we wouldn't have free trade agreement. This one thing, but as regards to this Eurasian customs union, I'm just entering into a discussion with you. I think it will be more interesting. If they make this kind of reservation in their agreement, for example, Armenia joining the customs union makes reservation, and Russia and other members of the customs union agree that free trade with Georgia remains, then it will remain, but it is unlikely. I think that Russia will not. For example, with Kazakhstan already raised its tariffs on imported cars, for example, which from Georgia, because these tariffs are 15–17% in Russia. No, it's re-exported tariffs, cars coming to Georgia, then going to Kazakhstan. And now we cannot export duty-free these cars to Kazakhstan, and this actually influenced negatively very much our exporting ability or export possibilities. This is so theoretically I think you are right because it is possible theoretically, but in practice this will not work, I am sure, because Russia will demand from Armenia, and Russia has right as the member of Customs Union to demand from Armenia concern in all goods, concern the same tariffs which Russia has. And Russia has quite high tariffs in goods, imported goods, than Armenia. This is the problem.
So then I would like to answer it, because if the Customs Union follows that road, then there will be globally something more fundamental than just Georgian-Armenian trade, because then Armenia and Kyrgyzstan have to start negotiations with all WTO members from scratch, because they are part of the WTO. They negotiated tariffs, and their tariffs are lower than what Russia now wants them to have in the Customs Union, and that's a more fundamental problem. Until now, Customs Union did not have any member that other than Russia that was already a WTO member. And in the Russia's case, Russia first became the member of the Customs Union and then a WTO member. And this created a huge mess in the WTO. Now, indirectly, Belarus and Kazakhstan they are not WTO members, but they are in the membership negotiations, but they already took their obligations in the Customs Union. So now they are saying that, well, we have to accelerate WTO accession, because otherwise there is a huge asymmetry there. Now, if Armenia and Kyrgyzstan, who are WTO members, join Customs Union, and we'll know that they will join, there will be a big block of legislation and obligations that probably they have to renegotiate. I don't know how WTO members are going to handle it, and I don't know what obligations exactly they will take in the Customs Union. It will depend on that. But what Gaha is saying, yes, theoretically they could be requested to stop trade and change their trade regimes, but there are two things. First, other Customs Union members have not been requested so far by Russia, and we have continued to trade with them. Second, if they are requested to readjust all their trade relations, this will start a negotiation wave in the WTO that will be long term, and that will create also political sensitive issues in a context where there is already a third WTO dispute filed, for example, by the European Union against Russia. So within the less than 2 years membership, Russia already has a very bad reputation in the WTO, where normally EU officials say it openly. Normally they wouldn't file a lawsuit so quickly against a new member because they give a new member a chance to adjust. That's sort of the common practice, right? It's not like that in Russia's case. So yes, we know politically they can do anything. They have done it before. I'm not excluding that there will be another embargo type of thing from the Russian side. And also the attempt to pressure other Customs Union members to do that. But actually they shouldn't do it because these free trade agreements were there before the Customs Union. And it is also difficult to bring precedents because there are very few customs unions in the world. This is not what countries do normally. European Union is not a customs union, it's a common market. The only customs union that comes to my mind is actually EU-Turkey customs union. There are no many customs unions, but when this customs union was created, it was not meant that the partners should review their trade policy in the negative sense towards other partners. So if the Russian-led customs union does it, it would be a negative precedent.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I'm very glad to hear this Armenia question surface here. First, of course, because it's one of your direct neighbours, it's very important for you. But this is going to be a big mess. A further dimension or illustration of the Armenian mess in acceding to customs union is that Armenia has tabled a list of 900 proposed exemptions from the common external tariff, to which Russia has said, "Нет, спасибо." And so there's a standoff here. I don't know what the result is going to be, but this list of objections is thoroughly understandable, because joining the customs union means raising Armenia's low tariffs. Armenia, like Georgia, has an interest in being a small, open, very open economy, and thus modernizing itself. So this is underlying the point that when Armenia was on the 3rd of September in the bilateral meeting between Putin and Sarkisyan, basically persuaded it to join the customs union and to renege on signing of Vilnius. This was absolutely for political reasons or implicit threats like we are your security guarantor, or we can make life difficult for your diaspora in Russia. Nobody knows exactly what was said, but it must have been something like this, because this whole affair is absolutely against any economist's view of Armenia's economic interests. Now, this, to my mind, this will be a mess, and we don't know how it will come out. And Kyrgyzstan will be another mess. To my mind, at some point, the rational thing would be for the European Union, with its DCFTA partners, to have a serious professional discussion with Russia and the customs union, and to have decent, loyal, open trading regimes between the DCFTA partners and Russia, as well as the DCFTA with the EU. Now, on a technical point, Tamara, on this Turkey-EU case, I don't agree with either of you. I absolutely disagree with you, and I half disagree with you. First of all, this was an illegal exception. Illegal in any literal...
Yes, but it was possible.
This you agree with me?
But it was possible.
Yeah, but I don't even agree with you that the European Union said, okay. The European Union... No, you didn't, but he did. The European Union, but I've been in conversation with the people concerned. They said, we see this happening, and we don't look. Because the trade policy trade consequences for the European Union are minimal. This is a sensitive political issue. Basically, it's a good idea for Turkey and Georgia to have free trade, and we will catch up on this later on. But this is an aberration. This is absolutely, well, the customs union normally means not just the common external tariff, but it means the entirety of the trade regimes, which includes indeed possible free trade agreement. Now, where I do agree with you is that there is a set of CIS pre-existing free trade regimes. In some way, it should be possible to repackage that legally or functionally and make it a set of free trade agreements with the DCFTA partners. That probably needs to be tidied up, but it could be done.
Yeah, so...
Thank you very much.
On this, so yes, it was, the rule is that members of the customs union have parallel trade policy. And I remember the process, Georgia asking the EU and Turkey to start free trade negotiations, and I was chief negotiator of that agreement, so I attended all the meetings with the EU, with Turkey, and the negotiations itself. So what I'm saying is that it is possible, right? It became possible, and it was legally not violating any big agreement, otherwise EU wouldn't do it. But the easier thing with the Turkey customs union is that it actually doesn't cover agriculture at all. So Turkey gave us the tariffs that they would agree with the European Union, but in agriculture they have very high tariffs. If you look at the external tariff of Turkey on nuts, it's 84%. On grapes, it's 100 and something. And EU tariff, yeah, and apple, like fruits and vegetables on average is 50–60% in Turkey, whereby in the EU it's average tariff on agriculture is not even 10%. So it is not a type of customs union that you have in the Russia-led customs union. In that sense, the whole agriculture is excluded from that, and therefore it's easier to interact with this customs union because it's not that tight and it is not based on political instruction of one partner on the other, so it's even hard to compare. I compared it several times, but I wanted to clarify that it's actually an entirely different setup.
Thank you.
Just coming back to your question on Russian Foreign Ministry statement, I checked with Google, and it was combined statement. First, Russia is worried by Georgia's intentions to strengthen its relation with NATO. Your Minister of Defense made such a statement, and that was the reason for the statement, for the position of the Russian spokesman of the Foreign Minister. And afterwards, after NATO, you have taken into account that signing the inter-relationship agreement with the EU may cause some damages, but only after NATO first.
Thank you very much. And there are still questions. And I asked Ambassador Bashir first, and this is very much subject that concerns his direct work and obligation.
Thank you. Thank you. I will pose the same question, but in a more simple way. I think it was already posed by my colleagues. What might happen to Georgian exports to Russia after 27th of June if Russia, because of some political reasons, imposes European tariffs to our goods?
Russia, fortunately, Russia is a member of Eurasian customs union, and Russia unilaterally cannot increase tariffs on Georgian export. It should be a decision of the customs union, the decision of the new body, agreed with Belarus and Kazakhstan. So it could not take place immediately, first. Second, it requires accepting of Belarus and Kazakhstan.
Frankly speaking, let's put politics aside for a while, but for technical and trade-related reasons, why would Russia impose, technically it would not be justified. And also the Russian argument earlier with regard to Ukraine, you remember what they were saying was that if Ukraine has a free trade agreement with the EU, European goods through Ukraine will come to Russia. And this is actually not true, because the whole basis of the free trade agreement is certificate of origin. You only apply free trade regime if you have a paper that says that this good comes from whatever country is in question in this case. So automatically through Ukraine, because of the free trade agreement, or through Georgia, EU goods will not go to Russia. Because if these goods have rules of certificate of origin of a new country, then Russia will apply the same regime that it has with the EU. If it's regular most favored nations, it is that. If whatever, if it would be a free trade agreement, it would apply a free trade regime. So that major argument that Putin has been repeating over time cannot be substantiated. There is no rule that would justify that. Maybe, I don't know if I answer your question and if this is what you were asking, but also wanted to mention this because this has been repeated in the press many times.
Thank you very much, Tamara.
Yes, I would refer back to responding to the question to my old friend, Ambassador Aleksashenko. I'm very glad to see here. This comes into the disinformation department. I've heard Putin say at least twice or three times that Russia cannot risk being flooded with EU goods coming in through Georgia. The rules of origin business for WTO members exclude this. These goods have to be materially transformed in Ukraine to become made in Ukraine, in which case that could happen. Another specimen in the disinformation department comes from Rogozin, who you may know around here as well. His masterpiece recently in Moldova was saying, we object to Moldova's signing the DCFTA, because this is on the road to EU membership, and we know that EU membership will only happen if Moldova already becomes beforehand NATO members. Mr. Rogozin, Deputy Prime Minister, whatever he is now, seems not to have noticed that Sweden, Finland, Ireland, Cyprus, and Malta became EU members without becoming NATO members. So this is just a grotesque example of disinformation. And this other one on the Ukrainian imports is, if you like, a subtler version, but it's no less incorrect.
Thank you very much. I just provoked this question that does it mean that it is correct to force the country like Ukraine to become a neutral country? Because there are examples of Finland, Sweden, Malta, and you said one more country is yeah, because as I see that what Putin wants from Ukraine, it's neutral status. And if West agrees on the neutrality of Ukraine as a condition of re-establishing relations with Russia, etc., it means that Ukraine is not asked whether Ukraine wants or not this status. So Ukraine's freedom is somewhere put off or ignored. This is, I think, unacceptable for the modern world.
Well, first of all, it is not at present an official issue at all. And I mentioned earlier, Poroshenko noted that the majority of the population of Ukraine are not keen on NATO membership. And in the European Union itself, there will be quite a number of member states who would not want to encourage the idea. Now, that does not mean that Ukraine itself, in its bilateral relations with Russia, might want to adopt a position that was, if you like, Russia-friendly, like when Poroshenko has already made a friendly remark. The Russian side might come back and say, well, yes, we quite agree, that's excellent, would you please write that into a treaty or into the constitution? At that point, Russia would say, well, we prefer not to, probably. But that's an issue for them.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is an interesting opinion, and please go ahead with your question. I see you're in the center. I don't know your name, sorry.
Thank you. Just a question about, I mean, one of the reasons Georgia and Azerbaijan matter to Europe is, of course, oil and gas. And a lot of the discussion about it following events in Ukraine has been towards accelerating the EU doing more to diversify its supply of oil and gas. So I'm just wondering, at the same time, or in the run-up to Armenia's decision not to sign the Vilnius summit, Putin visited Azerbaijan, and during that visit, if I remember rightly, there was a joint venture signed between the two energy companies, a Russian one, I don't know, Gazprom, Rosneft, and Sokar. It was a 6-month agreement that evaporated, I think, in February, but nothing happened. So I'm very curious about what happened there and more broadly, given all these discussions about Europe diversifying its oil and gas supplies, what implications that has for how Russia views both Azerbaijan as a source of Caspian energy and also Georgia as a major transit country for oil and gas.
First, I'm not an expert on oil and gas, but from what I read, Russia is not part of the lot about these pipelines, because Russia does not believe, Russian authorities, Russian experts on oil and gas, they do not believe that Azerbaijan has plenty of gas that will be supplied to Europe, influencing the overall volumes of European import of gas. So Russian export of gas to Europe is something like 150 billion cubic meters a may benefit from flows, from water flows, from gas flows. For Georgia, it will be an alternative source of gas, but for Russian Gazprom, Russian gas positions in Europe, it's not a factor. Moreover, as I understand, in any event, it will go south into the south of Europe, either to Italy or here to Austria, where share of Russian gas is not dominating. Yes, the crucial situation is in Czechia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, that are dependent on Russian gas to 90+%. All the rest, Russia's not part of this.
Thank you very much. And if there are other questions, yes, please. Maybe the last, I don't know if my...
I will try to be very fast. You mentioned several times the doing business indicator, and Georgia was one of the best performers doing business indicator in 2010, if I'm not wrong. And anyway, it was part of the trend in Georgia environment for business. Now in 2013, the amendments changed relevantly the labor code. But in the association agreement, there are several directives that in 5 or 10 years, then they will significantly change the labor code, they will put regulation agency, and they will affect badly, let's say, this glamorous ranking of doing business indicators. So I'm talking mostly about the strictness of employment measure that is very important in the doing business ranking. So my question is, Georgia characterizes itself like very capital friendly country, and sociologists will say, leftist sociologists will say, race to the bottom country in the right of worker with basically no limitation for environmental issues. How it will affect in after association agreement implementation the economy from this point of view?
Thank you very much. I think Tamara.
The doing business ranking has a very specific methodology. And actually, I think that I know that methodology quite well because I was part of the team that was working also with World Bank to supply information, etc. So it's a very technical, particular methodology. And at some point, there was a freedom of hiring and firing index, which was actually related to the labor legislation in that index. So at some point 2 years ago, doing business removed that part from the formal calculation, but continued to do the evaluation in all the 189 countries that they review, and they publish it every year. But formally, it does not factor in to the doing business overall rank. So there are 10 indicators. Labor legislation has been replaced by getting electricity. So there is another new indicator, how easy it is if you construct a facility to get electricity, like to do all the work. But generally, of course, we have to be very attentive, and that was also my point in my speech, that we have to be very careful in not worsening, but at least maintaining, if not improving, the comparative advantages that we created for Georgia. And even if doing business doesn't measure it, it's very important for us to have a flexible labor code. Doing business is important, but our development is more important. So we need a flexible labor market, which makes it easy for companies to hire new people or even replace people. And recent amendments, frankly speaking, I don't agree with some of them, because it's not only about firing, but they make hiring people more difficult, because they make it more difficult to hire people for short term. It's difficult now to hire a person for 3 or 6 months if you need someone for a specific project. And actually, to be very frank, this is not required by the EU or ILO, because there is no single ILO convention that regulates the duration of employment. There is no law about it. How can they require from us? So that's what I mean when I say that we should be careful when we talk about we comply with international obligations, because there are many cases where there is no obligation whatsoever about it, and we still do it.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I have also a few words about it. That I just want to say that in this Doing Business Index, Estonia, Denmark, Norway, which complies with EU rules, not being member of the European Union, Great Britain, I think Ireland also, they're ahead of Georgia. So they are members of the European Union or associated to the European Union in terms of legal approximation. For example, Norway is full acquis is implemented in Norway. So if EU acquis doesn't affect these countries and they are able still to become the best in doing business, why it should affect Georgia implementing provisions of the DCFTA? I think that these are a little bit different and not misleading perception, saying that European integration can affect business development in the country. So this should be treated more carefully. I think that's my opinion. Thank you very much. And would you like to add something on this particular point?
In the DCFTA, Georgia will become compliant with, I think, 37 European Union directives and regulations in the labour market and social policy here. So there's quite a lot there. But now here I completely agree with you. That's a massive legislation that becomes law legislation. But indeed, the effective flexibility quality of the labour market does not appear to be constrained by this law for practical purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if there are no more questions, I would like... Yes, it's a fun. I understand. Thank you very much, all of you, for such attention and your passion. And I would like especially to thank our distinguished presenters, Mr. Aleksashenko, Miss Kovziridze, and Mr. Emerson, for their very, very interesting and very, I would say, deep contributions